Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. welcomes Dan Kreiss and Ephraim Smith to the program. Dan is the Associate Minister for Mission and Community Outreach at Roswell Presbyterian Church in the Greater Atlanta area. He was previously Professor of Youth Ministry and Dean of the School of Missions at King University in Bristol, Tennessee. Ephraim Smith is the co-lead pastor of Midtown Church, a thriving multi-ethnic community in Sacramento, California. His books include Raising Up Young Heroes and The Post-Black and Post-White Church. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at lauren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined today by Dan Kreiss and Ephraim Smith. Hello, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Let's begin. We do have two of you, so and we do. It sounds like we have some time limitations, but Dan, start with you would just about your journey of faith, your background, what that looks like, and how you got to where you're at today.
Sure. So, a journey of faith, that could take a long time, but essentially I've spent a whole lot of time serving in ministry, most of that lay ministry, not pastoral ministry, all over the world. I spent about 17 years in New Zealand, working with indigenous peoples in New Zealand and also as a chaplain counselor of a boys' school. New Zealand, if you know anything about Australia and New Zealand, it's very much a post-Christian nation where, 4 or 5% maybe have any Christian affiliation. So that's definitely influenced and shaped my understanding of faith and the response, particularly of emerging generations in returning back to the United States. And so now, just recently, was serving as missions pastor at Roswell Presbyterian Church, but just took a call, and so start in about 2 weeks as head of staff at Lake Murray Presbyterian Church, just outside of Columbia, South Carolina.
Okay, wow. It's exciting.
It's something.
Yeah. Ephraim, how about you?
Yes, I am originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and so I grew up in the church. I grew up in the African American church in the National Baptist Convention. But I also was deeply impacted by an evangelical Methodist church that existed in Minneapolis that became very multiracial over time. It was it was an exclusively white church at one point, but as the neighborhood changed, because families like mine moved in, many white churches had to decide if they would stay in these parts of the city of Minneapolis, or would they move to the suburbs and stay exclusively white congregations. Park Avenue United Methodist Church made the decision to stay in the community. They lost a number of their members because of that, but over time they regrew as a multiracial, multi-ethnic church. So I'm simultaneously influenced by the African American church and the evangelical multi-ethnic church. Gave my life to Christ in high school, was a theater and communications major in college. My wife's grandfather as well as my youth pastor, had a significant influence on me sensing a call to ministry. So I was a youth pastor, a high school basketball coach in Minneapolis for about 12 years, then planted a church called the Sanctuary in a denomination called the Evangelical Covenant Church in 2003. Pastored that church for 7 years. From there, I became a superintendent in our denomination. That's how I made my way to California. And then the last 7 years, I've been the co-lead pastor at Midtown Covenant Church, what we call ourselves, we're a multicultural, metropolitan, multi-campus church in the heart of the city and beyond. And so that's what I'm up to now. Married with 2 adult daughters and a son-in-law.
Awesome. Share, if you would, Ephraim, and Dan, I'll ask you the same question too, about spiritual practices, anything that's meaningful for you, you're willing to share?
Yes. I mean, for me, prayer walks have become an important part of my spiritual practices, just kind of, getting out, now that I live in California and not Minnesota, I get outside all year round, basically. And so I just like getting out and looking at the mountains, looking at the sky, spending time with the Lord, listening, walking. But regular time in the Word, not just for sermon development, but for me personally, is important. And I have a small group of men that I'm involved with. And so, my spiritual practices include prayer, silence, in the Word, but also being in a smaller community of other brothers that are journeying with me.
Mm-hmm. Dan, how about you?
Yeah, for me, much like Ephraim, I love the out of doors and spend a lot of time on my road bike. Actually, is a good place to meditate and pray. But I've just recently been rereading with a small group Richard Foster's classic Celebration of Discipline, and kind of going through some of those spiritual practices again. I can't, I've read that, as you probably have too, multiple times, but I keep going back to it and being reminded and refreshed about some really critical things, including things like confession and how that takes place both individually and corporately. The practice of solitude is really important to me. I think of a cyclist. You probably, if you're in your area, you might have big groups of people that kind of annoy traffic. Well, I'd go all by myself, and that's that's solitude and time for meditation, while at the same time being out in nature. So those practices are really important. And like Ephraim too, as a pastor, coming to the Word not just for preparation for communicating to somebody else, but really for your own spiritual nurture is critical.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, you both. Let's get into this book we're looking to talk about today. Dan and Ephraim are the authors of Church for Everyone, Building a Multi-Inclusive Community for Emerging Generations. So I'm not sure which one of you wants to take this answer, but talk about kind of the goals and aims of the book, sort of how it came to be, all that stuff.
Well, I'll hand it over to Dan, because this project was his original idea, and I was very fortunate that he was open and agreed to allowing me to join him in the development of this resource.
Okay.
Well, and also, to be fair, it wouldn't have existed were it not for Ephraim. So it's definitely a collaboration, but it came out of much of my experience, like I said, in New Zealand, and then coming back to the United States and wondering, I have 4 adult children of my own, and wondering why emerging generations felt so disconnected from the church, both in New Zealand where I was working, but also and more significantly here, because in the United States there's much more of a culture of church participation, and yet it seemed like the rise of the nuns, as they call it, NONES, seemed to be significant amongst emerging generations, and that's concerning for multiple reasons, but not least of which is the faith development of individuals. And so this book came about ultimately because of my own experience in the a university setting and talking with young people and research and writing that I was doing for my doctor, and recognizing that there seemed to be some soft barriers that were communicating things to the emerging generations in the church that were off-putting to them, and were communicating something other than what I believed was God's intent for the church. And so as continue to write that, and some of that is this inclusive nature, that we seem to be very siloed in our congregations. And that can be based on ethnicity, but it can also be based on political ideology or socioeconomic status or all that stuff. And yet in every other aspect of young people's lives, they're involved in multi-dimensional relationships of ethnicity and socioeconomic standing and educational level, and yet the church seemed to stand out as a stark distinction of siloed congregation. That did not seem to be what I felt God was communicating the church to be, and so that's where it came about. And then discussions with Ephraim, we kind of collaborated and realized that much of our passion lined up. And so that's really how this book came about.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was interesting to me is the way you try to have that throughout the book as I read it, that kind of that both and nuanced tension, holding both sides approach. So one of the things that stood right out to me was on page 38, you talk about how a church should be both vertical and horizontal. I think that's something that I was just having this conversation with, as we're recording this, my last guest, Dr. Walter Strickland. In other conversations, I feel like this comes up too, is this tension between, there's some churches that want to make Christianity solely about me and God with no kind of practical implications for our world today. And then I think in some Christian circles, there's this kind of like Christianity is solely about me and my neighbor with really no kind of supernatural implications. So talk about the importance of Christianity and church being both vertical, as you say, and horizontal.
Yeah. I mean, well, for me personally, this comes out of, again, my being influenced both by the African American church and the evangelical church. For me now, specifically, a denomination called the Evangelical Covenant, which originally was called the Swedish Covenant Church, but then I joined, so they had to change the name. But the Swedish Covenant Church in its origins was about pietism, that me and God, that pietistic nature of I'm in God's word, I'm in prayer, I'm growing in my relationship with God, and it's impacting my life, my formation. Out of the African American church, it wasn't that the African American church doesn't emphasize that at all, but there's a strong emphasis, at least in my upbringing in it, of liberation. That Jesus set us free from sin, but also set us free from the shackles of slavery. That Jesus reconciles us unto God, because Jesus is God. And so we find intimacy again with God through Christ Jesus, but Jesus cares about the marginalized Samaritan woman. And so that's how, for me, my pastoring, has been informed by both the vertical and the horizontal. That yes, sanctification is a major part of the Christian life, but I also believe liberation is too, because sin is not just in the soul of individual human beings. Sin is also in systems in society. Sin is in structures, in ideologies, in institutions. And so we need a justice and righteousness biblically that can live itself out through the church that recognizes both of these dimensions of sin.
Yeah, something else that I want to talk about here that I found interesting, and this came up again in a previous conversation I had with a guest, Brian Davis, who's an evangelical worship leader. He talked about in his context in Denver, like many churches are moving rather than the kind of the mega church commuter model to really trying to emphasize a parish or neighborhood model approach to church, which you all both write about. Dan, do you want to talk about that shift from the kind of huge attractional commuter church to really something being more parish or neighborhood centered? And maybe define the word parish, since folks may not understand that in context.
Sure. Yeah, we do write about that quite a bit. The parish model is essentially taking the structure, the building of your congregation or where you meet, and then drawing a circle around, a mile wide or whatever. It comes from the English, the Anglican Church, and where the parish would be the town, the local town, and the vicar would be the vicar for that entire community, whether or not the people in that community darken the doors on a Sunday morning for worship. That was the person you went to when it was, time to get married, or there was someone sick that needed to be visited, or there was a funeral to be had, and that person was ministering, regardless of their understanding of faith, and hopefully ministering to them so that they come to faith. But that's the parish model. And so what we've had in the United States has been this attractive, almost a marketing purpose for church. And we have this, we talk about it a little bit, in the book, about the principle where we need to find our niche market, and we're going to develop a church specifically for them to attract them from all sorts of neighborhoods. And the parish model says, well, actually, where we're located, there are all kinds of people in this neighborhood that come from all different backgrounds and perspectives and ethnicities and all that stuff, and they belong in the church, and that we actually grow and learn more in our own faith and our understanding of God if our community is more diverse. And so that's really what the parish model is encouraging.
Yeah.
And it also doesn't have to be huge then. It's not,
right.
It's not this megalith. So the book is not necessarily speaking to how to make your church bigger. Church for everyone doesn't mean we're going to blow the doors out because there's so many people coming. What it means is that in my community, I'm serving everyone.
Yeah, I think something that was interesting is this shift of, again, being okay with, because again, when there's emphasis on kind of growth at all costs, right, there is this kind of shift of what is the ultimate of value, or what's the ultimate of importance, right? When it's growth at all costs versus, again, staying local, that really changes the priorities, right?
Yes, I would agree with that. I mean, and, I pastor what would be deemed a megachurch, but, where I believe even for us, we need to pay attention to this parish model, this parish expression is, one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that the emerging generations, they don't like sitting in the traffic that my generation's willing to sit in to get to work. To go, there are people my age and older that live in Sacramento because it's much more affordable to buy a house in Sacramento, but they're getting up at 4:30 in the morning and they're commuting to the Bay Area for work. And then they're getting home at 7 p.m. in the evening just to start it all over again the next day. And so, but there's a younger generation of people that they're like, I want to live close to where I work, and I want to ride my bike to work. If I've got somewhat of a commute, I want to ride the light rail train to work. And so even when I was pastoring back in North Minneapolis, Sanctuary Covenant Church, there were folks coming to our church, but younger, in their 20s, early 30s, that they're like, I'm a part of this church because I'm a public school teacher, a mile from here, and my family moved here. This is my first time living in the inner city. I grew up in a rural town, or I grew up in a second ring suburb, but I'm white. I'm teaching in a predominantly African American and Hispanic middle school, and I want to live in this neighborhood. So, that is leading itself towards not only a parish model, of like, I want to go to church where I live, but it's also creating a model of what are we doing to address the social ills in this community? I have a vested interest in seeing justice and seeing disparities dealt with because I live here now and I'm not just watching this on the news.
Yeah, and especially right when you're not driving by it, right?
Yes. Yeah, and we want to make it clear, Loren, that this book is not a formula for growing your church.
Right.
At least not growing it numerically. What it's again, the purpose of it is to make it more the church that God desires it to be. And that does not necessarily mean numbers. And a matter of fact, as Ephraim already attested to in his church growing up, like potentially by becoming more inclusive or more diverse, some people will leave because they are uncomfortable with that. So we just need to be aware that this, we don't want this to be another one of those books where people pick it up and think, oh, this is what I got to do to make my church bigger and compete with the guy down the road. That's not it at all.
Well, let's stay on that trend because I think one of the things that was interesting to me that I think I've kind of felt, but I don't know if I've read on paper is you all write that it's easier to start a multi-ethnic church than to become one. So Ephraim, you certainly talked about that, in your experience growing up. Why? I mean, I suppose it's obvious, but maybe say it again. Like what are some of the real challenges, Ephraim, that you experienced, and Dan, you're welcome to speak in this as well, that are sometimes too much to overcome, and why starting that way is so much easier?
Yeah, well, the American church begins in the American story, good and bad.
Right.
And so the church has its origins in the racial origins, the racial tragedy that is our historic story. And so the church is birthed in the midst of slavery. It navigates its way through Reconstruction into Jim Crow segregation. And so the older the church is, the more it is deeply rooted in the soil of a racialized society and all that comes with that. This is not to say, oh, that means this church is racist or something like that. It could also mean this church started as a church for Swedish immigrants. It started as a church for Italian immigrants, German immigrants. And so, or the church is white in its culture. So when churches that are already predominantly exclusively white or black, an expression of Asian or Hispanic, attempt to become multi-ethnic, a lot of times their diversity is still built on assimilation. We want anybody to come, but you're assimilating into the established culture that is already here. Versus when you plant a church, there's a better opportunity to start it from the standpoint of reconciliation versus the standpoint of assimilation. So I'll give you a quick example. Is when we planted Sanctuary in Minneapolis, when we first started, we used to have these multi-ethnic dinners, and I would encourage people to bring a dish that represented their upbringing, their culture. So we had the enchiladas next to the collard greens, next to the fried rice. We had sweet potato pie and pumpkin pie. And I would say to people, except for issues of allergies, I'm asking you to get a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
Because as we digest one another's foods, this church is going to be predicated in part on digesting one another's stories, one another's pain, one another's triumphs, one another's cultures. It's easier to do that when you plant a church than when you step into an established church, though through Dan's contribution to the book, he focused a little more than I did on there's still a challenge to the established church if it doesn't want to die. Because it's one thing to say this book is not about, this book is definitely not about church growth, but it's also about, we don't want our church to die.
Right.
It's already in decline. And so this commitment to being more inclusive while remaining biblical will keep churches that have been around 100 years from dying.
Let's go into that, Dan, because you all write in the book about the importance of being willing to experience discomfort, about why it's essential for the dominant cultural group to permit other voices. Again, I'm thinking of, like Ephraim talked about, this traditional church, whether it has roots in an immigrant community, whether it's just a long-standing kind of white church that's been around, 100 years, 150 years, 70 years, depending on the community, that they have this kind of dominant tradition, but they don't necessarily want to die. How does one lead them? Like, where does a pastor even start, I guess? I mean, I love that idea from you, Ephraim, about like try other foods, my goodness. But Dan, what do you think? Where does one even start if you're trying to lead an existing church toward change?
I mean, it can be what Ephraim's already said, something as simple as that, to branch out. And so when we talk about everyone needs to feel a bit of discomfort, essentially what that means is that I have to be willing to put my preferences on the shelf, recognizing that the way that I worship, or the order of service, or the foods that we eat at our potluck dinners, or all those things are oftentimes culturally established rather than biblically established. And so that means that in order for me to experience a more full expression of worship and service and begin to work in areas of justice and reconciliation, as Ephraim talks about, I need to hear from different voices and understand different perspectives. So as a leader, how do we help them do that? And that's really challenging, because oftentimes, again, particularly in this polarizing time of life that we're in, particularly in the United States, for some people that comes across as political, or the kind of derogatory term now is woke theology and all that kind of stuff, and that's not the desire at all. The desire is to kind of broaden our understanding and realize what God is doing. And so in the book, there's a whole chapter that says, it says, whose idea was this? We go back through the Old and New Testament to say, look, this was God's intent from the beginning. And even the people of Israel, who saw themselves as God's chosen people, recognized that, through the writing, that, well, this is not just about us. And so as a pastoral leader, sometimes it means difficult conversations. Sometimes it means that you need to be one on the cutting edge of beginning conversations with, maybe different congregations or different people in your community. Begin those conversations. And by doing that, then open those conversations up to others through shared meals, or combined worship services, or podcast interviews, or whatever that your community can slowly begin to digest.
Yeah, Ephraim, I'm looking at this quote from 153 about the assumption that is often takes place that God's work is best done through our own cultures. And I think many of us, even if we're honest with ourselves, like, we don't even recognize that we're assuming that, how have you led? How would you advise leaders and pastors to help lead their congregations and their people to starting to be able to see their own framework, and how they're seeing the world through their own lenses?
Yes. Well, first of all, I know that it becomes challenging talking about race in the current landscape we're in. And so we've got to find ways to talk about race in ways that are healthy, that are productive, that are fruitful and faithful, but saying, I'm not talking about this to demean, to demonize, to divide. I'm talking about this because sometimes putting the truth on the table allows us to live in community better. So, and I say that to say that we do have to acknowledge that the church religious experience of white brothers and sisters has been made the normative experience of church. So it is only the church of those deemed minority people that the ethnic minority title or descriptor is put on their church. So it's like if somebody goes, I go to an African American church.
Mm-hmm.
I go to a Korean church. I go to a Hispanic church. Most white Christians don't say, I go to this white church
Right.
in Phoenix.
Right.
I go to this white church, outside of Philadelphia. They say, I go to an evangelical church. I go to a gospel church. I go to a Bible believing church.
Mm-hmm.
I go to it's almost like I go to a church where Jesus is really preached.
Yeah.
And so the white church has been made the normative, universal experience of church. It's also been described as this is the more enlightened. This is the place where you can get a more clear understanding of who is Jesus, who is the church, what is the gospel. And so I think we have to start by saying, no, even the predominantly Anglo white church is cultural in nature. There's parts of it that they're more cultural than they are biblical. So that's one. But the other thing I think we have to unpack is, the churches that Paul and James and Peter were writing to were multicultural, multi-ethnic churches trying to not just stave off false teaching, but we're really trying to figure out how to live in the community together. This is why James, for instance, is like, you rich people, you oppress the poor and you're not paying them fair wages. And basically what James is saying is you rich people are sitting in church with poor people that you're praising Jesus on today. And you're going to go to work tomorrow and you're not going to pay them right.
Mm-hmm.
I got to write to you about this. Or Paul is saying, look, Christ died so that all of us would die on some level, so that we wouldn't see each other anymore from a worldly point of view. 2 Corinthians 5. And so I think we have to acknowledge that there are some things that we've made sacred in church that are cultural, so that we can get to a more biblical experience of reconciliation. Last thing I'll say about this briefly is, because this book is about the emerging generations and the kind of church they may be looking for, or they've already left the church of their parents for. The parents and grandparents of the emerging generation chose churches based on the racially segregated world in which they lived. Their children are going to work with people from the Middle East, people from the Ukraine, Hmong people, Filipino people. They're on social media navigating a world. My daughters have friends that look like the United Nations when they're all together. My oldest daughter is African American. She married a white guy. They're looking for a church that can be home for both of them. So interracial marriage is up in the United States. Adopting children across race is up in the United States. The number of children born of mixed race is up in the United States. So people are looking for a church not based on their parents' and grandparents' experience, but on their multicultural, multi-ethnic experience right now.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I want to come back to that the question about emerging generations, because I think that's a super important question for the church, broadly speaking, today. But Dan, I want to ask this real quick too. I think it's a easy tendency, especially amongst white churches, is to kind of like, hey, the past is the past. It is what it is. How do you all write about the importance of not forgetting the past to move into the future? How do you lead congregations to engage with the past as they look to the future?
Yeah, well, C.S. Lewis talks about that in terms of a math equation, right? And if you're kind of getting you get to the end, you can't just change it from there, but you have to go back and address the issues back in the equation to kind of get a different result. And that's essentially what we're saying. You're right. In many ways, we can't go back and change the past, but we can go back and acknowledge the past and recognize what place our congregation, even if I wasn't alive at that time, our congregation played in that. And, and then work to apologize and change the way that we do things going forward, so that we don't continue to proffer those ideologies or those things unintentionally. And again, sometimes we do that, just because this is our culture, this is how we do things. Makes me very uncomfortable. My tradition in the Presbyterian Church, they have often what's called, well, it's usually on All Saints Day, they'll do what's called Heritage Sunday. And Heritage Sunday, they'll bring bagpipes in and they'll parade all the tartans in and all that kind of stuff, because, traditionally the Presbyterian Church comes from the Scottish area. And that's not a bad thing. We want to embrace some of that heritage. But Heritage Sunday, what it also does is it minimizes or chooses to ignore what that church did or what those people did when they came to the United States. Yeah, our heritage, part of our heritage was enslaving people who looked different than us. And so without acknowledging that and just coming in, being proud of our heritage and minimizing that, which was wrong or sinful in our heritage, is not healthy. And again, I think emerging generations look at that and go, man, there's a tension here. There's something here that you're completely ignoring. That's we need to address in order to move forward, in order to be more who God wants our congregation to be. And so again, as a leader is sometimes having to speak those things out loud.
Yeah. I want to come back to the question about the future church and, Ephraim, if I heard you right, it almost sounds like you're saying like the future church is multi-ethnic. A, like, do you think that's true? And B, like how do we start leading that shift and preparing churches for that shift?
Yeah, I do believe that there are not enough multi-ethnic churches to accommodate the growing population that will be desirous of that kind of faith community. I don't know as of yet if the multi-ethnic church will become the dominant church, if the majority of churches, but we see growth in the multi-ethnic church. We see it going from, less than 10% to close to 20% to more than that now, that so when there was a Newsweek article that came out in the year 2000 called Color My World. So it was the May 2000 issue of Newsweek. So that's 24 years ago, right? So it said at that time that 30 years before, in the 1970s, 1 in 100 children born in America were born of mixed race. 1 in 100. It said at that time, by 2000, it was 1 in 19. And in states like California, Illinois, New York, it was 1 in 10. So now we're 24 years since that article was written. So and because the church is in decline, there's other books that not necessarily focused on multi-ethnic, but David Olson, this was back in 2010 or so, wrote the book, The American Church in Crisis, and talking about the decline of the American church. And towards the end of the book, he did lift up the multi-ethnic church as part of the hope of addressing the decline. So I just think that, again, if we continue to be an ever-increasing multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial nation, and we want to be evangelistic and disciple-making, that in and of itself will call for the need for more multi-ethnic congregations.
Yeah, Dan, you mentioned off the top, you've done a lot of work in New Zealand and in what might be called a post-Christian society. I'm thinking there's certainly that trend, right? We might say, broadly speaking, in America, of certainly moving from at least the post-Christendom society. Like, does a multi-ethnic church resonate more with young people or young adults? Like, talk more about how a multi-ethnic church might be more conducive to their context and culture and helping them engage with the faith.
Right. One of the things that Ephraim says in the book, and it's a quote from when I interviewed him for my own research, was it may not be the main reason why emerging generations are walking away from the church, but it gives them one more excuse.
Yeah.
It's one more thing this is a way that it seems like the church is not anything like the rest of my reality. And so, I think there's multiple aspects to why emerging generations are disengaging from the church. I do think that the multi-inclusive church is more reflective of one, who God desires the church to be, or what God desires the church to be, and also will resonate more with emerging generations. But I also think that there are other cultural things that are happening. I think that this church may remain in decline, even with the growth of the multi-ethnic church, just because of what other forces that are happening in society. But that doesn't mean that this isn't something we should pursue. And again, I think for me, the desire to write this book and pursue this, yes, we want the church to remain vital and vibrant because of the message of the gospel, and because of what Jesus has done, and because I believe, as I believe Ephraim believes, that the church is the best place to reconcile our culture. But that's not the purpose for this. The purpose for this ultimately is that we can be the people of God, the family of God that God desired from the beginning. And I think that's what's going to resonate with young people most substantially. And again, this is not a guarantee by pursuing multi-ethnicity or pursuing multi-inclusivity that we're going to stave off a decline in faith, just because, again, some of the other pressures. But faith is growing in many areas. When Ephraim talked about the decline of the church, who was that author, Ephraim?
Yeah, David Olson. He used to be the executive minister for church growth and evangelism in our denomination.
Right. And so some of that is, and people will look at that and think, oh, churches are closing all over the place, therefore the church is in decline. And numerically that is true. But what they're often referring to, again, is the normative church. What's the normative church? It's the white middle class church. Yes, they're in decline. But that doesn't mean that the church universally in our nation or around the world is in decline. Matter of fact, in some places of the world, it's exploding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ephraim, let's have you close with this. If I heard that right, Dan quoted you from your interview with him that the church is the best place to reconcile culture. I think, whether it's societally, this idea that church is outdated and irrelevant, while I think there's some voices right within the church who think church is too much of the problem, too much aligned with this or that or the other, or too broken. Why do you think, again, if I'm understanding you correctly, why do you think that church is the best place to lead and reconcile?
Well, one, the church has some biblical mandates, to love your neighbor as yourself. And the definition of neighbor goes beyond, your specific ethnicity or nationality or tribe. We have the Great Commission to make disciples of all nations. We also, in places like 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and even other places in Ephesians, have the call to reconciliation. And that call to reconciliation not only includes being reconciled to God in Christ Jesus, but again, because the churches weren't coming from the homogeneous place that the American church is coming from, reconciliation did really mean, will Jews and Gentiles live harmoniously in this community? And so I believe that the church, with its flaws, still remains the only institution, the only movement where unity, where reconciliation is a priority, is a mandate. If corporations are diverse, but their mandate is to sell products and to make money. Politics, we recently witnessed this. There's a winner and a loser. And so the politics of America is not set up for unity. It's set up for, within a two-party system, to say this party won So now this party gets to decide. This party gets to enforce its mandate on all people. The church, the Christian church, remains the one place in my mind where reconciliation, unity in Christ Jesus is not supposed to be an option.
Yeah, I'm thinking again, like the last 2 years, right? So many corporations have gone to DEI approaches. And then when they've gotten pushback on that, they're like, oh, never mind. Like, it's not convenient for our business, money-making endeavor. So we're just going to like quietly shelf that.
Yeah. I mean, the original reason why corporations drift towards DEI is they're making customer-based decisions.
Right.
If Pepsi knew they could be $1 billion corporation and only sell Pepsi to white people, they would be doing that. Yep. But they go, oh my gosh, Black people and brown people are drinking Pepsi, and we need to take it. We need to get into that market, or Coca-Cola is going to just rule there. So let's hire an African American and let's study how we can get more African Americans, more Black and brown people drinking Pepsi. So, I mean, corporations, man, I really made that really, really sound bad, but companies make customer-based decisions. The church is supposed to make kingdom-based decisions.
Yes. Yeah, I got to write that down.
Yeah, which is very different.
Too. Man, I should have said that in the book.
Loren, the challenge, I think, when looking at the church, is that we've been through a lot, with the pandemic and then the racial unrest and all that stuff. And the church should have been the exemplar. The church should have been one that public entities and corporations and political establishments should have been going to and said, how do you do this? How do you reconcile? Because we see that you are doing it effectively and efficiently, and you are doing it in a way where everyone's included. And yet when those things happened, nobody turned to the church, because the world, for whatever reason, doesn't see the church as having the answer to that, because I don't think we've exemplified what God desires the church to be. And again, had we been living it out the way we were meant to live it out, I think that would have been the turning point, that they were like, when all this unrest happens, well, let's go to our church leaders, because they know how to do this reconciliation. They know how to be inclusive in a way that we don't. But they looked at the church and they're just like us, maybe even more siloed than we are.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know we're running out of time here, so let's just do this. The book is Church for Everyone, Building a Multi-Inclusive Community for Emerging Generations. Dan and Ephraim, do you want to just both share how folks can connect with you, get the book, all that stuff?
For me, you can just find me, Ephraim Smith, on Instagram, on Facebook. Encourage you to go to midtownchurch.org to look us up that way. But I definitely encourage you to pick up the book wherever you can get books, Amazon, bookstores. And again, for me, it's an honor to partner with Dan around this project.
Yeah, my contact details are changing because in 2 weeks I'm in a new location, but the church will be a Lake Murray Presbyterian in Chapin, South Carolina. But again, just like Ephraim, Dan Kreiss at Instagram or on Facebook, and we'd encourage you too. And I just finished an 8-week study of the book in my previous church with about 80 people, and it was a fantastic way to kind of have some challenging dialogue and discussion with multi-generations. And I would encourage pastors or leaders, elders, or whatever, to pick that up and do it as a group study, because it was powerful.
All right. So I guess before, I'll make sure I get with you when the show notes come out to make sure we get up-to-date contact links for the show notes. But gentlemen, really appreciate your time. Really appreciate the conversation. Thank you for contribution to the book and for this conversation today. So I always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.